The alarm was already screaming when I reached the observation deck. I had been asleep for exactly 40 minutes. The first real sleep I had managed in 3 days, when the sound tore through the ship like a blade. Not the soft chime that meant a routine alert, the full klaxon, the one that meant something was happening that nobody had planned for. I pulled on my jacket and ran. The corridor was narrow and the lights were still on emergency red. People moved past me going the other direction, fast and quiet, the way people move when they are afraid, but trying not to show it. I pressed myself against the wall to let a crew of 4 technicians push cart of equipment through. One of them looked at me. I did not recognize his expression at first, then I did. It was the face people make when they already know how something ends and the ending is not good. The observation deck was on the port side of the upper hull. It had a wide viewport made of 3-inch reinforced glass, and on a clear day in deep space, with no nearby star to wash out the view, you could see more stars than you could count in a lifetime. I had spent hours at that viewport. It was one of the few places on the ship where you could breathe and forget, for a moment, everything that had gone wrong over the past 2 years. I forgot nothing that morning. Through the glass I could see it being towed in. It was enormous. That was the first thing. Even at this distance, even against the backdrop of open space where scale becomes meaningless, the size of it was clear. It was longer than our station by half. It had once been a warship. You could see the bones of what it had been in the shape of its bow, in the angles of what remained of its hull plating. But the hull was cracked open in 3 places, long gashes that ran from the belly of the ship to its upper spine. 2 of its 4 engine nacelles were simply gone, broken off at the mounting points, leaving jagged metal stumps. The 3rd nacelle was dark. The 4th flickered once and went dark as I watched. Behind it, pulling it on a tow cable thick as a building, was a Vreth carrier. I had seen Vreth ships before. Everyone in the fleet had by that point. You could not spend 2 years fighting a war against something and not learn the shape of its weapons. The carrier was long and flat, shaped like a blade laid sideways, and it moved through space with the easy confidence of something that had never lost. Its running lights were a deep violet color. The Vreth liked violet the way humans liked white. It meant authority. It meant ownership. It meant they were enjoying this. I heard boots behind me and turned. Commander Vasquez was standing at the entrance to the observation deck. She was a small woman with short gray hair and eyes that had not softened since I had known her. She was not looking at me. She was looking through the viewport at the thing being towed in. Her name was Clara Vasquez, and she had commanded warships for 19 years. She had fought in 3 engagements before the war with the Vreth, and she had fought in 11 engagements during it. She had never surrendered a ship. She had come close, twice, and both times she had found a way. That was what I knew about her before that morning. By the end of that day, I would know one more thing. She was a person who could look at total humiliation and turn it very quietly into purpose. She walked up beside me and looked through the glass for a long moment without speaking. "That," she said, "is the ISV Thermopylae." I knew the name. Everyone in the fleet knew the name. The Thermopylae had been one of our heavy escort vessels before the war. She had been captured in the first wave of Vreth advances, during the engagement that we did not have a good name for yet, because naming it would have required admitting how badly it had gone. The Vreth had taken her intact, or mostly intact, and kept her in one of their repaired docks for reasons nobody entirely understood. Some analysts thought they were studying her. Others thought they simply wanted her as a trophy. Now they were giving her back. That was the part that made no sense to me, standing there that morning. The ceasefire had come 6 months earlier, negotiated by people I had never met in rooms I had never seen. I was not a diplomat. I was a systems engineer with a specialty in power distribution. I had been assigned to this station as a repair consultant after the ship I had served on, the ISV Dorchester, was too damaged to fly and waiting on parts that might never come. I had been here for 4 months when the Vreth towed in the Thermopylae, and in those 4 months I had learned to expect almost nothing good from any direction. The ceasefire agreement included something called a reparation vessel. It had been presented by the Vreth negotiators as a gesture of goodwill, a symbol of mutual respect as 2 civilizations worked toward a peaceful coexistence. That was what the official document said. I learned later that the Vreth diplomatic word for what they were doing translated more accurately, in a loose sense, as returning broken tools to those who cannot build better ones. They had given us back our own ship because they considered it worthless. The broadcast came 20 minutes later. The Vreth carrier transmitted on a wide-band frequency that reached 17 star systems simultaneously. It was not aimed only at us. It was aimed at everyone. The message was brief, and the translation algorithm worked quickly. A Vreth official voice, flat and precisely modulated, announced that in the spirit of the ceasefire, the hegemony was generously returning a human vessel as a demonstration of Vreth magnanimity and patience. They called us the Salvagers, not by name, not by fleet designation. They called humanity the Salvagers, and the tone of the word, even filtered through a translation program, carried something that needed no algorithm to understand. It was the tone a person uses when they hand a beggar something they were about to throw away. In the station's main corridor, I saw two crew members stop walking and look at each other. Neither of them said anything. One of them looked at the floor. The other looked at the wall. That was the effect of the broadcast on morale, right there in front of me, in about 4 seconds. I went back to the observation deck. The Thermopylae was being maneuvered into the docking cradle now. Up close, through the high magnification lens attachment that someone had left clipped to the viewport rail, I could see her in real detail for the first time. The hull breaches were worse than they had looked from a distance. The gashes in her side were not clean, they were ragged, like something had been torn away rather than cut. The plating around the damage was warped and discolored. 3 of her sensor arrays were gone entirely. Her forward torpedo bays were collapsed inward, the doors fused shut by something that had burned very hot and very fast. She was a mess. She was a disaster. She was 43,000 tons of metal and broken systems and old damage, and she had been handed to us because the people who gave her back assumed we could not do anything meaningful with her. I looked at her for a long time. Then I heard Commander Vasquez's voice from the corridor entrance again. She was not talking to me. She was talking to a group of people who had gathered behind me, engineers and technicians, and 2 pilots who had nothing to fly. Her voice was level, and it carried no drama in it at all, which was somehow the most striking thing about it. "Nobody is going to send us parts," she said. "Nobody is going to send us a crew. Nobody is going to authorize a rebuild at a proper yard. We are not going to ask for any of those things. What we are going to do is fix her with what we have, and then we are going to make her fly. Not because anyone is watching, and not because anyone expects us to. Because she is ours and she is fixable, and we are the people standing in front of her." She paused for a moment. The station hummed faintly around us. Somewhere deeper in the hull, a pressurization pump cycled on. "Nobody asks permission," she said. "We just get to work." There was no cheer. Nobody clapped. The group of people simply turned, one by one, and started moving back down the corridor toward the docking cradle. I turned with them. I want to be honest about what I felt at that moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel inspired. I did not feel the sudden surge of confidence that you read about in stories. What I felt was something simpler and more durable than either of those things. I felt like I had a task in front of me that was real. Not paperwork, not waiting, not watching the stars through a viewport and trying not to think about everything that had been lost. A broken ship, 43 people. One order, make her fly. I followed the others down the corridor and did not look back. That was the day we started. I did not know, standing in that corridor with the klaxon still fading and the smell of recycled station air in my nose, what we would eventually do. I did not know what we would build, or what we would have to face, or what we would become. I did not know that the ship they handed us as an insult would become something that made an entire civilization reconsider what the word threat meant. I just knew we had work to do, so we did the work. The first thing I learned about the Thermopylae was that she was worse than she looked, and she had looked very bad. The initial inspection took 3 full days. 2 teams of 6 people each, moving through the ship from bow to stern, with sensor equipment and handheld lights and a great deal of quiet swearing. I was on the second team, led by a structural engineer named Owen Marsh, who had the habit of pressing his knuckles against the wall of a damaged compartment and closing his eyes, as though he could hear what was wrong with it if he listened carefully enough. He usually could. He had been doing this for 26 years. We went through the ship section by section, and Owen dictated everything into a recorder while I took notes the old way, on a physical pad, because 3 of the ship's 4 internal computer cores were offline, and the 4th was running at about 8% of normal processing capacity. The list grew and grew. The primary fusion core had cracked along its containment seam, not a catastrophic failure. The emergency shutoffs had done their job, which was probably the only reason the ship had survived at all. But a crack was a crack, and a cracked containment seam on a fusion core was not something you patched with a sealant kit and a prayer. You replaced it. We did not have a replacement. We did not have the equipment to manufacture a replacement. We had the crack and we had Owen Marsh's knuckles pressed against the casing, and we had time. The torpedo bays were a separate problem entirely. All 4 of them had been deactivated, 2 physically and 2 electronically. The 2 physical deactivations were permanent by normal standards. The bay doors had been fused shut, using a Vreth welding process that worked at temperatures our tools did not reach. The 2 electronic deactivations had corrupted the firing control software so thoroughly that even recovering the code structure would have taken months. And even then there was no guarantee of function. Life support was working, technically, but the oxygen recyclers were running on a Vreth replacement component that none of us recognized. It was clearly doing its job. The air was breathable, but nobody could tell exactly how it was doing it, which meant nobody could predict when it might stop. The water reclamation system had 3 separate leaks, all slow, all manageable for now. The engines were the thing that nearly broke morale entirely on day 2. 1 engine was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The Vreth had removed it at some point during the ship's time in their dock, and they had done it cleanly. The mounting points were intact. The connections were clean. The housing was undamaged. They had simply taken an engine out of our ship, presumably because they wanted to study it, and handed the ship back with the gap still there. There was no note of explanation in any of the transfer documents. Of the remaining 3 engines, 1 was functional at roughly 60% capacity. 1 had a cracked injector housing that would need to be replaced before it could safely ignite. The 3rd had a power coupling problem that was, and I quote Owen Marsh directly here, a fascinating disaster that I have never seen before and do not entirely understand yet. I wrote all of this down. My pad filled up. I started a second pad. On the evening of the 3rd day, all 43 of us gathered in what had been the ship's main briefing room. The room still had its original table and chairs, which was a small mercy. The ceiling lights worked in 2 of the 3 sections. The air was slightly too cold. Owen Marsh stood at the front of the room and read out the full damage assessment without any preamble or softening. Just the facts in order, from the most critical to the least. It took 40 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent. Then a woman named Kay Albright, who was the ship's senior power systems specialist and had a dry sense of humor that only surfaced when things were genuinely dire, said, "Well, on the bright side, the chairs are fine." Someone laughed. It was a short laugh, a little ragged at the edges, but it was real. Then someone else laughed. Then it spread. And for about 30 seconds, the cold briefing room, with its 2 functioning ceiling lights and its cracked fusion core and its missing engine, was full of the sound of people who were tired and scared, finding something genuinely funny. Commander Vasquez did not laugh, but she smiled, just briefly. Then she said, "Right. Let's talk about what we can actually do." What followed was the most productive planning session I had ever been part of. Not productive in the way of clean decisions and clear timelines, but productive in the raw sense. Every person in that room had something to contribute, and over the next 4 hours, they contributed it. Problems were stated, and then immediately attacked from 3 or 4 angles at once. Ideas that sounded impossible at first were not dismissed. They were stress-tested, pulled apart, and sometimes rebuilt into something that actually worked. It was a lead engineer named Neil Patel who first noticed the thing about the Vreth power coupling. He had been staring at the replacement component in the oxygen recycler for 2 days, turning it over in his hands during breaks, examining its connection points, running it through our portable diagnostic equipment. He came to me on the afternoon of day 4, when I was cataloging the wiring in the weapons bay, and he said, "I think they overbuilt everything." I asked him what he meant. He showed me. The Vreth component was designed to do one thing: recycle oxygen in a standard Vreth atmosphere processor. But its internal architecture, the actual way it was built at the circuit level, had redundancies that made no sense for its intended purpose. Backups for backups. Parallel processing loops that the main function never used. It was as though someone had taken a simple tool and built it on the frame of something much more complex, and then only connected one of the many things the frame was capable of doing. Neil had a theory, and over the next week, as he examined every Vreth component on the ship, the theory became a conclusion. The Vreth built their systems using standardized cores and then limited what those cores actually did through software and physical connections. The hardware was always capable of far more than the intended function. It was a design philosophy that, in the Vreth context, made perfect sense. Standardization meant easier manufacturing, easier repair, easier replacement across their enormous fleet. But it also meant that if you were someone who understood the hardware and was not bound by the Vreth software limitations, you could make those components do things their manufacturers never intended. Neil called it opening the lid. The Vreth built everything with a lid on it. We were going to take the lid off. The work that followed was intense in a way that I struggle to describe accurately. Not dramatic. There were no moments of sudden breakthrough, with lights blazing and people shouting in triumph. It was slow and careful and often frustrating, and the frustrations were real. The cracked fusion core took 11 days to seal using a process that Neil designed and that Owen Marsh was deeply skeptical of until the moment it held pressure. The skepticism did not slow him down. He simply did the work while maintaining his doubts, which I found oddly admirable. The torpedo bays were the breakthrough that changed everything. The 2 physically fused bay doors could not be opened. That was final. But the 2 electronically deactivated bays were a different problem, and a woman named Helen Doyle, our weapons systems specialist, had been attacking that problem from the day we boarded. Helen was methodical in the way that certain engineers are methodical. Not because they have been trained to be, but because their minds simply do not function in disorder. She kept everything in handwritten tables. She color-coded her notes. She slept 6 hours exactly and woke up at the same time every day regardless of what had happened the day before. On day 6, she came to the briefing room after dinner and spread 4 pages of handwritten tables on the table in front of Commander Vasquez and said, "I cannot restore the original firing system. It is gone. But I have been looking at the structure of the 2 remaining bays, and I think I can rewire them into a single unified discharge system using the Vreth power coupling architecture that Neil has been mapping." Vasquez looked at the pages. What would that give us? Helen paused for a moment. In theory, a linked discharge that draws on both bays simultaneously and releases through a single coordinated firing sequence. The power output would be roughly 3 times what either bay could do individually, because of the redundant loops we can tap through the Vreth couplings. In theory. In theory, Helen confirmed. I have not tested it on anything. I cannot test it here without risks I am not comfortable with, but the mathematics work, and Neil's mapping of the couplings confirms the capacity. Vasquez looked at the pages for a long moment. Then she looked at Helen. Build it. We called the system the chain pull, because of the way it worked. The 2 bays pulled from each other in a linked sequence, each feeding the other's discharge cycle, like 2 people pulling a rope together. It was an ugly name. It was also ours, which meant something. The Thermopylae began to take shape. Her hull was still scarred. Her plating was still mismatched in the places where we had cannibalized parts from the station's storage to patch the breaches. Her functional engine count was 2.5, because the cracked injector on the second engine was repaired but still running at reduced output, and Owen Marsh refused to certify it at full capacity until it had logged more hours. She was not beautiful. She did not look like a warship that anyone would be afraid of. She looked like what she was. A broken thing that people had worked very hard to make less broken. But the fusion core held. The life support ran clean. The chain pull was installed and wired and waiting. And the engines, 2.5 of them, could move her. I was in the engine monitoring station on the first test run, watching the output numbers on my screen with my hand resting on the emergency cutoff panel, ready for anything. The startup sequence ran. The numbers climbed. The ship moved. She did not purr, she rattled. She vibrated in a low, deep way that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. When we engaged the main drive and she began to accelerate, the whole structure groaned as if it was surprised to be doing this again. I watched my numbers. I listened to the groan. I kept my hand near the cutoff. The numbers held. The groan settled. The Thermopylae was moving under her own power. I looked at the output screen for a long time after the test was complete and the ship was slowing back toward the station. Then I picked up my pad and wrote down the numbers, because the numbers were what mattered and they needed to be in the record. I wrote them down carefully. My handwriting was not steady. It took me a moment to realize why. It was the first time in 8 months that something had gone exactly as planned. Around the same time, the Vreth scouting frigate began its passes. The first time, it was far enough out that we registered it only as a sensor contact. A signature that matched Vreth propulsion systems, moving through the sector on what could plausibly have been a standard patrol route. We logged it and said nothing. The second time, it came closer. The third time, it held position for 6 hours at the edge of sensor range, just close enough to be seen and just far enough to be deniable. They were watching us. They wanted us to know they were watching us. I was doing a wiring check in the lower equipment bay when I heard about the third pass. I finished the check first, because the wiring needed finishing regardless, and then I went to find Commander Vasquez. I found her in the bridge, which was mostly functional by then, standing at the main sensor display with her arms crossed and her eyes on the contact marker at the edge of the screen. She did not look away from the screen when I came in. "They want to know if we got the ship working," she said. "What are we going to tell them?" She was quiet for a moment. The sensor marker sat at the edge of the screen, motionless, watching us from a distance that should have been comforting, and was not. "Nothing," she said. "Not yet." She turned away from the screen and walked to the navigation console. She ran her hand along the edge of it, not in any functional way, just contact. The way you touch something to confirm it is real. The bridge had been dark for years before we came aboard. We had brought it back. "They think we are still the people who surrendered," she said. Her voice was quiet. There was no anger in it and no self-pity. Just observation, accurate and clear. That was 18 months ago. "We are not those people anymore." She left the bridge. I stayed for a moment, looking at the sensor screen. The contact marker held its position at the edge of range, patient, distant, certain of its own safety. I looked at it for a while. Then I went back down to finish the wiring. It happened on a Tuesday. I know that sounds like an odd detail to remember, but I remember it clearly. It was a Tuesday morning, station time, and I had been awake since 4 in the morning because the oxygen recycler in Section C had been making an unfamiliar sound, and I could not sleep until I knew what it was. The sound turned out to be a loose mounting bolt. It took me 6 minutes to fix. I was standing in the corridor outside Section C with a wrench in my hand and machine oil on my jacket when the alert came through. Not the full klaxon, the tactical alert. 3 short pulses, a pause, 3 more. The one that meant a contact had been confirmed as non-friendly and was moving with intent. I was on the bridge in under 2 minutes. Owen was already there. Kay was at the power console. Helen was at the weapons station, which was still bare metal and exposed wiring in 2 places, but functional. Neil was not on the bridge. He was in the engine room, where he spent most of his time now, reading the Vreth power systems the way other people read books. Commander Vasquez was at the center of the bridge, standing with her hands behind her back, looking at the main display. The Vreth frigate was no longer at the edge of sensor range. It was close. And it was not alone. There was a second contact behind it, smaller, moving on a different vector, a civilian transport, one of ours. I moved to my station and pulled up the transport's identification data. The vessel was the Linwood Ferry, a converted supply ship running a refugee transfer between 2 of the colony stations in our sector. 41 people aboard according to its last filed manifest. It was slow, it was unarmed, and it was moving on a standard transit route that it had every legal right to use. The Vreth frigate was on an intercept course. This was, technically, legal under the ceasefire terms. The treaty prohibited destruction of civilian vessels, but it did not prohibit interdiction for inspection purposes. The Vreth had used this provision before. What it meant in practice was that they would cut off the transport, force it to a stop, board it, and delay it for anywhere from 2 hours to 2 weeks, while they conducted their inspection. Nothing would be destroyed. Nobody would be physically harmed. It would simply be made very clear, very publicly, to every civilian vessel in the sector, that the Vreth could reach them whenever they chose and that there was nothing standing between a civilian transport and an armed frigate. "Not until this morning," Helen said quietly, ready on the chain pull. I looked at Commander Vasquez. She was looking at the display. The frigate's course line was clean and direct, tracking toward the Linwood Ferry with the unhurried confidence of something that had never been challenged. "Power to engines," Vasquez said. "Move us out." Kay's hands moved across the console. The Thermopylae shuddered awake beneath us. The familiar deep vibration came up through the deck plates and into my feet, and I gripped the edge of my station and watched the displays as we began to move. The Vreth frigate saw us immediately. It would have, we were not making any attempt to be quiet. A ship our size moving under power is not a subtle thing. The frigate's course did not change. It held its line toward the transport, and I watched the 2 vectors on the display and understood that the Vreth captain had looked at our sensor profile, identified us as the Thermopylae, and decided that we were not a threat worth adjusting for. He had made a reasonable decision based on available information. The available information was wrong. The hail came through on open channel, no encryption, no diplomatic framing. The Vreth captain's voice came through the translation system, flat and precise, and the words that came out were roughly equivalent to, "Return to your station, salvage your vessel," or you will be removed from your course." Vasquez looked at the communications panel. "Open channel," she said. Kay opened it. Vasquez stood in front of the pickup. She looked at the display for one more moment. Then she said very clearly, 4 words. "Fire when you are ready." Kay closed the channel. Helen's hands moved. "I want to describe what happened next in a way that is honest. Because there is a temptation, I know, to make this moment into something it was not. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing you would choreograph. The chain pull fired, and the noise it made inside the ship was enormous. A sound like 2 thunderclaps stacked on top of each other. A physical pressure in the chest that you felt before you heard it. A flicker in the lights as the power draw spiked, and Kay's panel ran 3 warnings simultaneously that she cleared one by one without looking up. On the display, the Vreth frigate's shield indicator went from full to 0 in 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Helen had told us, during the weeks of testing and calibration, that she thought the chain pull would be effective against a standard Vreth frigate shield array. She had been careful not to overstate it. The mathematics suggested it, she had said. The calculations were sound, she had said. 3 seconds. The silence on the bridge afterward was the kind of silence that has texture to it. I became aware that I had been holding my breath without knowing it. I let it out slowly. Someone behind me made a sound that was not quite a word. On the display, the Vreth frigate was already changing course. Not toward us, away. Accelerating hard, going to a heading that would take it out of the sector as quickly as its engines could manage. There was no distress call. There was no communication of any kind. They were simply gone. The Linwood ferry continued on its transit route, apparently unaware of how close the morning had come to going differently. Vasquez stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the display for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at each of us in turn, Owen at structural, Kay at power, Helen at weapons, me at systems. She looked at us the way you look at people you have trusted with something important and who have not let you down. She did not make a speech. She said, "Good work. Owen, I want a full systems check before we return to dock. Everything. I want to know exactly what that discharge cost us and exactly what we have left." Owen was already moving. I looked at my display screen. Somewhere out in the sector, a Vreth frigate was accelerating away from us at maximum speed. Somewhere on 17 broadcast frequencies, the signal of that departure was already moving outward at the speed of light. I thought about the broadcast the Vreth had made when they handed us this ship, the one that had reached 17-star systems. The tone of that word, salvagers, and the certainty in it. I wrote in my pad, systems nominal, discharge effective, no damage to structure, chain pull, fully operational. Then I added, below the official notes, in my own handwriting. We did not ask permission for that either. 3 days after the frigate engagement, while Owen Marsh was still running his systems checks, and Helen Doyle was already asking for more test time with the chain pull, a Vreth diplomatic transmission arrived on the standard ceasefire channel. I was not in the room when Vasquez read it. She told us the contents at the next full briefing, standing at the front of the room with the same level voice she always used, as though the information she was conveying was of moderate importance, and not the sort of thing that could end all of us. The Vreth hegemony had formally designated the Thermopylae engagement as a treaty violation. 3 warships were being dispatched to our sector to investigate. We were to surrender the relevant crew members. The name of Commander Vasquez was specifically listed, along with Helen Doyle and Neil Patel, for questioning. If we did so, the incident would be considered closed, and no further action would be taken against human-controlled assets in the sector. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Owen said slowly, 3 warships. 3, Vasquez confirmed. I looked around the room, 43 people. 1 heavily modified ship that ran on ingenuity and repurposed Vreth components, and a weapons system that had never been tested against anything except 1 frigate that had subsequently run away. 3 warships of the kind that the Vreth used for what they called sector enforcement actions, which was a phrase that meant, in practical terms, the kind of thing that ended small conflicts quickly. A number of people in that room, I knew, were already calculating the odds and finding them unfavorable. I could see it in the set of their shoulders, in the way a few of them were looking at the table instead of the front of the room. I understood it. I had done the same calculation and arrived at the same answer. But I had also seen the Vreth frigate's shield collapse in 3 seconds. They are sending a response, Vasquez said, because they are embarrassed and because they want to re-establish a clear relationship between our capability and theirs. They want us to be afraid of what 3 warships represent. She paused. The question is not whether we are afraid. The question is what we do with it. She looked at Neil. How far have you gotten with the frequency mapping? Neil was quiet for a moment. He was a careful person by nature, and he did not answer questions until he had thought about the answer. Further than I told you at the last update, he said. She waited. Every ship in the Vreth fleet uses a variant of the same base communication protocol. It is the same design philosophy we found in the hardware, standardized core, limited by software implementation. The frequencies shift by vessel class, but the underlying architecture is consistent. He paused. I think I can generate a signal that the Vreth ships in range would interpret as a system directive from their own fleet, not a message, a command signal, the kind that their targeting and navigation systems would respond to as a fleet coordination instruction. What kind of response? If I broadcast on the right frequency at the right power level, it would look to every Vreth ship in range like a fleet-wide targeting recalibration order. Their systems would halt active targeting for the duration of the calibration cycle. He met her eyes. 11 seconds. The room was very quiet. How confident are you? Vasquez asked. I have been working on this for 3 weeks, Neil said. I am confident in the theory. I have not tested it. I cannot test it without broadcasting the signal, and broadcasting it to an empty sector tells us nothing useful. He paused. I will be more confident after we use it. That is honest, Vasquez said. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked at all of us. Here is what we are going to do. What followed, over the next 4 days, was the most complex planning process I had ever been part of. We mapped everything, the sector geometry, the likely approach vectors for 3 Vreth warships, the chain pull's effective range, Neil's frequency system, and what it required in terms of timing and power allocation. Our own vulnerabilities. 2.5 engines, 1 weapons system, a hull that could take 2 or 3 hits before structural integrity became a serious concern, and a crew of 43 people who had all volunteered for this, but who were not soldiers. Vasquez had one absolute requirement. We would not go looking for the engagement. If the Vreth ships entered the sector looking for a fight, we would be ready. But we would not go out to meet them. This was not, she said, about the distinction between offense and defense. It was about something simpler. She wanted the Vreth to commit to an action before we responded to it. She wanted them to make the choice. The Vreth ships arrived 6 days after the diplomatic transmission. They came in on a direct approach vector. No concealment, no attempt to be subtle about it. 3 vessels of the enforcement action class, longer than our ship, heavier, with full shield arrays and weapons batteries that were not modified or jury-rigged or held together by the ingenuity of 43 people. They were built by the largest navy in this arm of the galaxy, maintained by an industrial base that dwarfed ours, and crewed by people who were very, very good at what they did. On our bridge, I watched them come in on the display. The plan called for the Thermopylae to go dark before they arrived in close sensor range. No active systems, no running lights, minimum power, minimum emissions, the smallest possible signature. We had done this in testing. It was not comfortable. The ship without active systems was cold and very quiet. And the only things running were the passive sensors and the minimum necessary to keep life support stable. 43 people sitting in the near dark, watching passive sensor readouts, waiting. We were good at this. We had been living in a broken ship for months. Broken ships are quiet. We knew how to be quiet with them. The Vreth formation moved into close range. They were looking for us. Their active sensors were sweeping the sector in regular patterns, and I could see those sweeps on my passive display, the ghostly echoes of signals that were not aimed at us but were coming close. Close, and then closer, as the 3 ships reduced speed and began a systematic sector search pattern. They found the Thermopylae on the 3rd pass. Of course they did. We were not trying to hide forever. We were waiting for a specific moment, and that moment required them to be close. When the sensor return confirmed they had a solid lock on us, Vasquez said very quietly. Neil was at a station we had built specifically for this, a modified communications panel that ran through the Vreth power coupling architecture at the back of the bridge. He had his hands on the controls and his eyes closed, and he held that position for 2 or 3 seconds after Vasquez said his name, and I thought for a moment that something was wrong. Then he opened his eyes and said, "Broadcasting." I watched the display. The 3 Vreth ships held position for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. On the sensor display, their targeting signatures, the distinctive energy pattern of active weapon systems, flickered. Then they went dark. 11 seconds. Fire, Vasquez said. Helen's hands moved. The chain pull fired. The sound was worse this time than the last, partly because we had known it was coming and had been braced for it. which somehow made it more physical rather than less. Partly because Helen fired 4 times in sequence, working through a targeting pattern she had planned and rehearsed, and then planned again. And each discharge hit the bridge like a wave. The lights went to emergency power after the 3rd discharge. Kay was already compensating before the 4th fired, running power from the secondary coupling Neil had mapped weeks ago. On the display, 3 sets of shield indicators ran down to 0. I write that as a simple sentence. It is a simple sentence. But I remember the moment of looking at those 3 numbers. 3 vessels with full standard loadouts and full crew complements. Ships that had been built to enforce the hegemony's will across an entire sector. And watching those numbers reach 0. And the feeling that went through me in that moment was not triumph. It was something quieter. Something that had more to do with the 4 pages of damage assessment that Owen had read aloud in a cold briefing room, and the loose bolt on the oxygen recycler that had kept me awake at 4 in the morning, and the way the ship had groaned on her first engine test, like she was surprised to be moving. All of that work, all of it, in 4 discharges. The Vreth formation scattered. They did not retreat in good order. They broke, each ship going a different direction, and the communications traffic between them was thick and rapid. And the translation algorithm struggled to keep up. The readings suggested confusion rather than coordination. 11 seconds had been enough to break something deeper than shields. But the Thermopylae was not unharmed. The power draw of 4 rapid discharges had been more than we had tested. The 3rd engine, the one Owen had been cautious about, the one running at reduced output, had not survived the load. It had shut down hard, and when the damage report came through, it confirmed what Owen, arriving at my station with his jaw set and his eyes reading the numbers very carefully, had already suspected. The injector housing had fractured. It was not repairable at speed. We had taken hull breaches on 2 decks, glancing Vreth weapons fire during the targeting window before Neil's signal had landed. Both breaches were manageable. Both were also real. And 12 people had been injured in the engagement. Nothing severe enough to be life-threatening, but real injuries, from real combat. And as I helped carry a crew member named Gordon Webb to the medbay, he had a broken arm from a pressure wave that had knocked him across a corridor during the 3rd discharge. I was aware of the weight of him and aware of his face, which was pale and set and entirely without self-pity. And I felt the difference between a plan on paper and the thing the plan actually costs. We had won. I held on to that. We had won, and the Vreth were not coming back into this sector today, and 12 people had been injured and everyone was alive. And the Thermopylae was still flying on 1.5 engines, which was less than before but more than none. Gordon Webb, in the medbay, looked at the ceiling and said, "Is it done?" "It is done," I said. He nodded. Then he closed his eyes and let the medic work. 2 weeks after the engagement, the Vreth hegemony opened a formal diplomatic channel and requested a ceasefire negotiation. They did not call it a request. The word they used was something closer to a mutual review of sector security arrangements. The translation algorithm flagged it with a note that said, "Nearest human equivalent is a formal request with elements suggesting reluctance and reconsideration." I read that note twice. The Human Diplomatic Corps arrived 9 days later. 3 negotiators, 2 advisors, and a communications specialist, who set up in the station's conference room with equipment that was significantly newer than anything the rest of us were working with. They were polite and professional, and they had clearly been briefed. But there was a slight hesitation in the way the lead negotiator, a man named Colin Perry, first came aboard the Thermopylae for the initial meeting. He stood in the docking bay and looked up at the hull, the patched plating, the mismatched panels, the places where you could still see the original gash marks running under the repairs, and he was quiet for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. Then he said, "This is what you did it with." It was not really a question. "This is what we did it with," Vasquez said. He nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted. I was not sure what to call the expression. I had not seen it before on a diplomat. The Vreth sent an envoy ahead of the formal negotiation. A single shuttle, no weapons, on approach at standard diplomatic speed. The lead envoy's name, in translation, was something our algorithms rendered as Senior Adjudicator of Sector Relations, which was a title that gave nothing away about the individual behind it, but said something interesting about how the Vreth had decided to frame this meeting. Not a military representative, an administrative one. I was on the bridge when the envoy's shuttle docked. I was at my station doing a power systems check, the kind of thing that never really ended, on a ship like ours, and I heard the docking confirmation through the intercom and kept working. because the power systems needed checking, and that was still true regardless of who was docking. Vasquez came to the bridge an hour later, after the initial diplomatic exchanges. She stood at the viewport for a while without speaking. The sector outside was quiet. The Vreth patrol frequency had dropped to nearly nothing since the engagement. Our passive sensors still logged contacts at the outer edge of range, but nothing had come closer than they needed to. The envoy asked to see the ship, she said. Not the diplomatic facilities, the ship. Before the formal sessions, I turned from my console. What did you say? I said yes. She looked at the viewport. They need to understand what they are looking at. The tour took 3 hours. Vasquez led it personally, and I was present for most of it. The Vreth envoy was tall. They were almost always tall, and moved with a characteristic Vreth deliberateness that looked like caution to human eyes, but was simply their natural pace. The envoy had 2 technical advisors with them, and at certain points, those advisors would stop and examine something on the ship closely, running their own handheld instruments over Neil's modified power couplings, the structure of the chain pull housing, and then they would confer quietly with each other. At the engine room, the envoy stopped and looked at the 3rd engine, the one that had fractured its injector housing in the engagement. It was still in place, still connected to the ship's frame. Owen had sealed it and labeled it, and moved on to keeping the others running. The envoy looked at it for a long time. One of the technical advisors said something in Vreth. The translation came through in my earpiece. This component is Vreth manufacture. The envoy turned to Vasquez and said, through the translation system, you used our components against our ships. We used your components for our ship, Vasquez said. The application was our own. The envoy was silent for a moment. Then it said something that the algorithm translated as, roughly, this was not anticipated. No, Vasquez agreed. It was not. In the formal sessions that followed, over 3 days of careful and deliberate negotiation, the Vreth made concessions that no hegemony representative had made to a human delegation before. Not large ones. Not the kind of thing that changes a civilization's position in a single conversation. But real concessions, specific and binding, related to sector access and civilian transit rights, and the definition of what constituted a treaty violation. Colin Perry was professional enough not to show his reaction in the negotiation room, but on the evening of the 2nd day, I saw him in the corridor outside the conference room, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed and a slight smile on his face. He opened his eyes when he heard me pass. How is the ship? He asked. We are replacing the 3rd engine injector, I said. Owen found compatible components in the station stores. It will take another week. He nodded. He looked down the corridor toward the docking bay, though there was nothing to see from here. The Vreth had a word for your ship, he said. Before all of this, the salvager's vessel, they called it. It was a dismissive term. Their diplomatic team used it in their briefing materials. I know, I said. I heard the original broadcast. In their current briefing materials, he said carefully, they use a different word. Our translation team has been working on it for 2 days. The closest we can get is something like, he paused, choosing, the unrecognized threat. He said goodnight and went back into the conference room. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went back to the bridge. Owen was there, running his checks. Kay was at the power console, as she usually was when she was not sleeping. Helen was reviewing targeting data, making notes in her careful handwriting. Neil was on the floor behind his modified communications panel with a diagnostic tool in his hand, doing something technical that I did not interrupt. I went to my station. I sat down. I pulled up the power distribution readout, the same one I had been monitoring since we first brought the ship's systems back online, the one that had been my first view of how she was doing, and was still the clearest single picture of her condition. The numbers were better than they had been when I first logged them. Not perfect, not what they would have been if the ship had been properly overhauled at a full repair yard with a complete supply chain and 18 months of scheduled maintenance, but better than the numbers of a broken ship handed over by people who expected it to stay broken. I thought about what Colin Perry had said, the unrecognized threat. I understood what the Vreth had meant when they gave us this ship. I had understood it the morning I first saw her through the observation deck viewport, massive and ruined and being towed by something that owned it. They had meant, here is what you are worth. Here is the ceiling we have placed on you. Here is the vessel that matches your capability. What they had not understood, what I suspect they still did not entirely understand, even now, was something that is difficult to explain if you have not spent months in a cold briefing room, working on a problem that has no good solution except the solutions you make for it. The thing about humans and broken things is not that we are patient with them. It is not that we are good at repairs, though we are. It is something more specific than that. We do not fix things back to what they were. We fix things into what we need them to be. The Thermopylae had been given to us as a Vreth design warship in a state of disrepair. What she was now, after months of work by 43 people who were not soldiers and not heroes and not anything except very good at their specific jobs, and very committed to the task in front of them, was something the Vreth design had never intended and could not have predicted. She was still scarred. Her hull was still patched, and her plating was still mismatched, and her third engine was still waiting on its replacement part. She would rattle and groan when the drive engaged, and she would need constant attention for as long as she flew. But her chain pole had dropped 3 Vreth warship shields in 11 seconds. Her modified communication systems had silenced a fleet coordination network that the hegemony had used across hundreds of engagements. Her crew knew every component of her, had touched every circuit, and read every output value, and understood her the way you can only understand something that you have rebuilt from the beginning. She was not what they had given us. She was what we had made. On the final morning of the diplomatic sessions, before the Vreth Envoy's shuttle departed, I was doing a routine check in the lower equipment bay when I heard the docking announcement and went up to the observation deck out of habit. Through the viewport, I watched the Envoy's shuttle detach from the docking collar and move out into open space. It was small against the sector, small against the stars, small against the slow arc of the Thermopylae's scarred hull in the corner of the frame. I watched it until it was too small to see without the magnification lens. Then I went back to work. There was a wiring check that needed finishing. The power distribution in Section B had been showing a minor variance for 2 days, and it was the kind of thing that became a larger problem if you ignored it. I had a pad and a diagnostic tool and a section of conduit that needed attention. The Vreth Envoy was already accelerating to transit speed. The diplomatic team was packing up their equipment. In the conference room, Colin Perry was reviewing the final signed documents with the kind of careful attention that meant he understood the weight of what was in them. And on the Thermopylae, 43 people were doing the work that needed doing, because that was what we had always done and what we would keep doing. And the work was never finished, but the work was ours. They had handed us a wreck. We had not asked permission to do anything we wanted with it. We had not needed to. The variance in Section B turned out to be a loose connection behind panel 14. 2 minutes of work with a diagnostic probe and a small wrench. I fixed it and noted it in the log. Then I put my tools away and walked back down the corridor toward the bridge, past the patched hull sections, and the modified power couplings and the places where Vreth engineering and human necessity had been joined together into something that had no name yet, but that worked. And that was enough. They handed us a wreck. We returned complete annihilation, and then we sat down to negotiate, because that is what you do when the other side finally understands what you are.